The story I'm going to tell you about is a tragic one. It's full of injustice. But this story is not about what happened to one person. It's about how Jim Crow and racism and injustice stole everything from a black family. Everything they had to work for was wiped away like it never happened. This story is black history. The kind of black history that is hard to hear, but it is necessary to learn. And I really hope you watch this video. Not for me, but so that the memory of the family I'm going to tell you about won't be lost to the halls of injustice. This is an interesting story, and it's one that really captured me when I was learning about it. You'll understand why I say that if you watch this video to the end. This story has a lot of moving parts, so I need you to bear with me as I tell this story. As I said, this is not about a singular injustice, but rather an injustice to an entire black family. And I can't tell you about what happened to one of them without telling you about the entire black family history. And for that, I need to go back to the beginning so that you truly understand and appreciate just what was lost here, what was stolen, and the depth of the pain and tragedy and injustice that fell upon this one black family. Will Ward was born in Africa. Where exactly, we don't know, but the research tells us that he was brought to America sometime in the late 1700s or early 1800s, during the time of the transatlantic slave trade. Will was enslaved in Virginia. Will and another enslaved woman named Martha had a son named Isom, who was born sometime between 1825 and 1830. Will's master was a mean and brutal man. He farmed land in the Tidewater region of Virginia, but after 2 centuries of planting tobacco and corn every year, that land was worn out from overplanting. Keeping slaves on land that could not produce profit was costly, so the master decided to sell his slaves in Louisiana for a higher price. The master was likely engaging in what was called slave speculation. Slave speculators were crucial to the domestic slave trade in the United States, especially after the international slave trade was banned in 1808. They got rich fast by buying enslaved black people at low prices in the upper South and then transported them to the deep South to sell them at higher prices. These speculators would use brutal and inhumane methods of chaining black people together and forcing them to march long distances all across the South. These groups of enslaved black people were known as coffles and were a common sight on Southern roads. Will did not want to go to Louisiana, and he complained to the slave master. But the master did not care. It made no difference to him if Will and his family were broken up and sold away. He chained Will and the other enslaved black people together to the back of the wagon, and he began their 2,000-mile journey to Louisiana, with the black people walking the entire way. Will continued to protest, and for this, the master had Will beaten and given 20 lashes on the second day of their journey. On the third day, Will was still upset, so the master had Will tied and stretched by his arms and his legs, with a steel collar around his neck. While Will was constrained like this, the master still fed Will. He wanted to make sure that his property looked healthy when it came time to sell Will in Louisiana. The next day after Will was tied, the master came and found the glass that Will had been given to drink water broken into pieces on the ground next to him. The master unchained Will and he beat him. Will was tied to the back of the wagon and made to continue the journey. While Will was walking, he collapsed on the road. The master dragged Will behind the wagon, but Will could not get up. Will looked like something was wrong with him. Will would not eat or walk. Will died the next day. When Will was chained, he broke the glass and ground it into small pieces using the steel that he was chained to, and he swallowed it. Will had decided that he did not want to be a slave anymore. Martha and Will's small son Isom made it to Louisiana. Martha was pregnant at the time. She and Isom were sold to a slave owner in northern Louisiana. In 1859, when Isom was a young man, one of his master's relatives bought him for $1,500 and gave him to a man named Hezekiah McGee for a wedding present. Hezekiah McGee owned a plantation in Washington Parish, Louisiana. It's one of the Florida parishes located across from Lake Pontchartrain from New Orleans. When the Civil War ended and the Union Army came to free the enslaved black people of Washington Parish, Isom stayed with his former master Hezekiah McGee. He said he had nowhere to go. Isom remembered that when he was freed, all the black people were told that they would get 40 acres and a mule. He said no one got anything, but Isom was able to obtain land on his own. Here's how he got it. After freedom came, Isom stayed with his former master Hezekiah McGee. He helped his former master raise his children. After Hezekiah died, the McGee children taught Isom how he could homestead land and take possession of it, and that's what Isom did. This is the actual U.S. land grant given Isom land in Washington Parish in 1889. Before I continue, I have a feeling that some of you are saying, what does it mean to homestead land? Well, let me give you a very brief explanation of this, because it's important to understand why black people don't have land and wealth today. Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862. It granted 160 acres of public land to citizens and non-citizens if they lived and farmed the public lands. All they had to do was file an application, live on the land for 5 years and improve it, and then file for the deed of ownership. In 1866, the Southern Homestead Act was passed. This act explicitly allowed newly freed black men the right to obtain land in Alabama, in Arkansas, in Florida, in Louisiana, and Mississippi. But there was a catch. Distribution of the land was left to locals who were former Confederates. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 black people received federal lands under the Southern Homestead Act before it was closed. That's out of 4 million black people who were freed after the Civil War. Whereas more than 1.6 million white families, both native and immigrant, received land. By the year 2000, the estimated number of beneficiaries of the Homestead and Southern Homestead Act was around 46 million people, about 25% of the adult U.S. population. 270 million acres of land were given to white families. Practically none was given to black families. So when people say that black people should work harder or we don't have generational wealth because we don't want it, remember that the wealth that others have was given to them, and all they had to do was pay a filing fee for it. Actually, Dr. King talked about this. Dr. King said that emancipation for black people was freedom to hunger and freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food or land, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about homesteading and black land ownership, because I could talk about this and how black people were locked out of generational wealth that was given to others for an hour. So back to the story now. So Isom was taught how to homestead land by the McGee children, and that's how he got his land and began to build his family's wealth. Isom married a woman named Mandy McGee. She too had been enslaved. She was born to enslaved parents. Her father's name was Wiley Daniels. Isom and Mandy had 11 children. They worked hard and continued to homestead and acquire more land. When Isom died in 1911, he passed down 1,000 acres of land to his children. One of Isom's 11 children was a man named John Wilson. John was born around 1885. John was hardworking, just like his father. Isom taught John the importance of land ownership and wealth building. When John was just 18 years old, he bought his first piece of property. It was 50 acres. John had been courting a woman who lived near his family's farm named Tempe McGee. Tempe McGee was born in 1883 to Wade McGee and Julian McGee. Her parents were born into slavery in Louisiana. Tempe was one of 9 children. Her family were farmers in Washington Parish and lived near the Wilson. Sometime in late 1899, when John was around 19 years old, he asked Tempe's father, Wade McGee, if he could marry her. Wade said yes. John and Tempe worked hard on their first piece of property. They planted cotton and other crops. They were eventually able to pay off the notes on the land that John first purchased when he was 18 years old. John did all that he could to make extra money. He cut stove wood and he bought cattle for white men in the parish. Together, John and Tempe raised 9 children. They were Roy, Luther, Jerome, Moise, Bruce, Alexine, Burnell, Onshell, and Felton. With the land that his father left him in 1911, combined with the land that he bought, by 1934, John Wilson owned 2 farms that totaled close to 200 acres. John built a large house on his property for his family. He had the only painted and sealed house that was owned by a black person in the community. John was respected by all. He was a deacon at the Bethel Holiness Church, and he was a school trustee at the Washington Parish Training School for Negroes. He had done everything right in his life. John made a good living on the land. In 1934, his sons Jerome, Luther, and Moise were young men, and they helped him farm the land. Luther had gone to Southern University in Baton Rouge, where he learned the trade of blacksmithing. Jerome had worked as a cook in New Orleans and in Tylertown. He had come home in the summer of 1934 to help his father with the crop. John and Tempe's 12-year-old son Felton and their 10-year-old son Bruce would also help their father and brothers after school. John and Tempe's 13-year-old daughter Burnell, also known as Bunch, and their 11-year-old daughter Onshell, known as Red, would help their mother, who was known for being thrifty. Alexine was in the 10th grade and was attending the parish training school. I needed to tell you all of this history so that you could understand how this family had managed to do what so many black families did not. They made it through slavery and into wealth. Despite all of the barriers that were put in place to stop black people and to keep black people down, like black codes and convict leasing and segregation, this family thrived. But Jim Crow still ruled the day. And for black people, no matter how wealthy you were, your race could always cancel your wealth and status at any moment. The Wilsons lived in Washington Parish, Louisiana. It was not like other places in the South during the Jim Crow era. Washington Parish defied many of the complexities of black-white race relations that other parts of the South had. In most parts of the Jim Crow South, black people always showed deference to white rule to avoid conflict. But in Washington Parish, some black people were out front and assertive when it came to their dealings and interactions with white people. Also, in other parts of the Southern Black Belt, in states like Mississippi, white planters lived in opulence while their black sharecroppers barely made enough to live. In Washington Parish, however, many black people were successful farmers and owned land. This assertiveness on the part of black people was also driven by a small number of interracial relations and unions and families in that parish. The black children of the former slave masters lived amongst their white cousins and family members in Washington Parish. But Washington Parish also had a history of racial violence. In 1901, a mob of whites acted on a baseless rumor of a black rebellion and insurrection, fired at and took the life of a group of black churchgoers. This was known as the Balltown Riot. In 1934, the Wilsons' black assertiveness and land ownership met racism and racial violence. On the morning of July 21st, 1934, John Wilson went into town to take care of some business. Not soon after John left, a white man named Joe McGee, who was a stock inspector, came to the Wilson farm and claimed that a mule belonging to the Wilsons had not been dipped. Dipping the mule was a process where farmers immersed livestock in a chemical solution to get rid of pesticides like ticks, which spread diseases. This practice was required to protect the health of both animals and the agricultural community. When the inspector arrived, John Wilson was not home, and he insisted on taking the mule. 28-year-old Jerome Wilson told the inspector that he needed to follow the required protocol for livestock compliance and said that his father was in town and he would have to wait for him to return to discuss the matter with him. Inspector McGee did not want to hear this, and an argument ensued between Jerome and McGee. The Wilson sons refused to let the inspector take the mule and told McGee to leave their home. The inspector left upset, but this was not over at all. McGee went to a white neighbor's house and called the Franklinton Sheriff's Office and asked for help. He returned to the Wilson farm with the law. He brought Chief Sheriff's Deputy Delos C. Wood with him, along with the deputies Macaulay McCain and Bruce Spear. When the white men arrived at the Wilson's farm, the family was in the back of the home on the porch. The Wilson brothers were there with their uncle Samuel Wilson and their mother Tempe and their sisters. Deputy Delos Wood charged up the porch and told Jerome to come here. He called him a boy. I should mention that Delos Wood and Inspector McGee were distant cousins of Jerome Wilson on the slave-owning McGee side. Jerome and his brothers tried to calm things down. They did not want an escalation between the white men at their home. Jerome offered to give the mule to Inspector McGee, but Deputy Wood was not trying to hear this. He went to arrest Mose Wilson, who was the oldest of the Wilson sons. That's when chaos ensued. A struggle occurred between the Wilson brothers and the white men. Deputy Wood tried to draw his weapon, and the Wilson brothers tried to stop him. Wood eventually got his weapon out and fired at Moise, striking him in the stomach. Their mother Tempe tried to shield her sons, but she couldn't. Jerome was struck in the upper right thigh. Jerome then went into the house to get a weapon to defend his family. After it was all over, Moise, Luther, and 12-year-old Felton Wilson were all struck by the firing, and Deputy Wood was dead. As this was all going on, John Wilson was making his way back to his house on his mule. He saw cars passing by him in a hurry, but no one stopped to tell him what happened. Finally, a white man stopped him and told him that Delos Wood had been fatally wounded at his home by one of his sons. John hurried back to the house. It didn't matter who fired or who attacked first. All that mattered was that a white man was dead, and it happened at a black family's home. The entire Wilson family was arrested. Luther and Alexine ran, but they were eventually caught and taken to jail with the rest of the family. This was despite the fact that the evidence suggested that it was one of the deputy's own men who accidentally fired and struck him. They even arrested John Wilson, who was not even home when the incident occurred. The Wilson brothers were not taken to the hospital after being struck and wounded. They were taken to jail. No one helped them. Moise died in the jail cell. After the Wilsons were arrested and taken to the jail, mobs formed outside the jail hoping to lynch the entire family. There was no way that the Wilsons were going to get a fair trial in Washington Parish. This was the 1930s in Louisiana in a small rural area. This was a time when black people were lynched and no one cared to do anything about it. The mood was tense in Franklinton and there was a constant threat of lynching the Wilsons. Deputy Wood was a beloved figure. 1,500 people came out to his funeral. People were angry and they wanted revenge. The whites were not prepared to wait for the verdict and several lynching attempts were stopped by the authorities. To avoid more bloodshed, authorities in Franklinton promised that there would be a quick trial and a quick conviction and punishment. On July 24, 1934, the Wilsons were indicted by the grand jury. Jerome, his brother Luther, and his mother Tempe were charged with taking Deputy Wood's life, with Jerome being the one charged with firing the fatal shot. They were arraigned that day and appointed counsel, and they each pleaded not guilty. Judge C. Ellis Ott set the case for trial in 1 week on July 30th, 1934. The Wilsons did not want to take their chance with the court-appointed attorney, so they hired attorney M.I. Vernado to represent them. Attorney Vernado recommended that they hire another attorney, B.M. Miller, to assist him, which they agreed to do. Luckily for the Wilsons, because they had some family wealth, they could afford to hire the attorneys. But the prosecution was not going to be outmatched. The state appointed 2 attorneys to work as special counsel to help prosecute the Wilsons. When the case was called on Monday, July 30th, the Wilsons' cases were separated, and Jerome was to be tried first. Attorney Vernado quickly moved for a continuance. He told Judge Ott that they did not have enough time to prepare for trial because the Wilsons had only been charged the previous week. He also cited the fact that Jerome was still recovering from his injury, and this was a reason to move the trial. Judge Ott was not moved by these arguments. The community was demanding a quick conviction and an execution, or there would be a lynching. Jerome's trial was unjust and a sham. Whites filled the inside of the courtroom and also gathered outside, ready to lynch Jerome. All of the trial testimony blamed Jerome for what happened. After the jury began deliberations and Jerome was being taken back to his jail cell, onlookers shouted to get Jerome. The sheriff had to beg them to let the jury reach a verdict. With the mob waiting outside the courthouse, ready to lynch Jerome, he was quickly convicted. Judge Ott sentenced Jerome to die by hanging. After Jerome was convicted, the NAACP stepped in to help and rally behind this family. The New Orleans branch of the NAACP hired a well-known white criminal defense attorney named G. Ray Gill to handle Jerome's appeal and to represent Tempe and Luther in their upcoming trials. This must have made the prosecution concerned about their case because they soon asked for a continuance in Tempe's case. Attorney Gill filed an appeal with the Louisiana Supreme Court. Jerome's appeal was successful. On January 8, 1935, the Louisiana Supreme Court reversed Jerome's conviction. In reversing the verdict, the court said that Judge Ott erred in refusing to allow the continuance for Jerome's case. The court said that the fact that Jerome was injured and recovering and all of his relatives and witnesses were in jail made it difficult for his attorneys to prepare a proper defense. Even though Jerome had secured a second trial, he was still in danger. The mob wanted to take his life. In the early morning hours of January 8, 1935, Jerome was asleep in the Franklinton jail. A group of masked white men came to the jail for him. The overturned conviction had been the last straw for them and they were planning on carrying out Jim Crow mob justice. The mob gained entry into the jail. They searched for Jerome and they found him in a cell with his brother Luther. Jerome started screaming because he knew they were there for him. One of the men in the mob fired at Jerome through the cell bars before they even got to him. The men then made their way into the cell. They clearly had a key because they had no trouble getting into the building or the lockup. Jerome begged the men not to take his life, but they didn't care. He screamed out for help, but no one came. As Jerome lay bleeding on the cell floor, begging for his life, the men fired at Jerome again, striking him in the back of the head. They then beat him in the head with a hammer. After the men took his life, they dragged Jerome's body outside to a waiting car, drove a few miles away, and threw his body into a ditch near the Wilson's farm. His grandmother Julian will later say that you could not even tell that it was Jerome except for his mouth because his head had been so badly destroyed. It was the third time that they had tried to lynch Jerome. Only this time, it was successful. The morning that Jerome's body was found, his sister Alexine was headed to the school bus when she saw men standing near the crossroads. 2 white men stopped her and told her not to go over there because her brother was lying dead there. Jerome's lynching would be the first of 1934, But it would not be the last. This is a copy of Jerome's death certificate. This officially documents the brutality and injustice that took his life. The sheriff of Washington Parish, a man named J.L. Brock, said that there was no lynching that occurred. He refused to call it that. He said that men got into the jail and they got to Jerome and he was fired at because he would not shut up and kept screaming. He said that he would investigate to find out what happened. A coroner's jury was also convened, but as always, it found that Jerome had died at the hands of persons unknown. No one was ever held accountable for what happened to Jerome Wilson. There was fear and tension in Washington Parish after Jerome was lynched. Black people were scared, and black schools were closed. Black teachers left town, and black maids and black domestic workers quit their jobs working for white families. And whites were afraid that black people would retaliate. And black people had good reason to be fearful. A few weeks after Jerome was lynched on February 6, 1934, a group of drunk white men came into the black section of Franklinton, brandishing weapons at black residents. The white men went into a black barbershop and pointed their weapons. Everyone in the barbershop ran to a restaurant next door owned by a black man named Luke Crane. The white men then pointed and flashed their weapons at black people who were in the restaurant. Some black people quickly left, but one black man, Gene Clark, did not. He pulled his weapon and fired at the white men, fatally wounding a 25-year-old white man named Colden Butte. Now, this has an interesting connection to Jerome Wilson's lynching. Gene Clark was a first cousin of Jerome Wilson, and Colden Butte was the son of the jailer who was present the night that Jerome was lynched. Gene was initially taken to Baton Rouge after being arrested for fear that he'd be lynched. He was accused of doing the same thing that his cousin Jerome Wilson was just months prior. Now, Gene must have feared being lynched like Jerome because he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced by Judge Ott to serve 3 to 9 years in prison. We don't have all the details as to what happened with Gene's criminal case and him pleading guilty, but there is strong evidence to suggest that he acted in self-defense when he fired and took Colden Butte's life, and Gene's guilty plea was a part of a plan to keep him from being lynched. And the reason why I say that is because the very next year, in December of 1936, Louisiana Governor Richard Laish commuted Gene's sentence to 2 years. For what Gene was accused of, black people were lynched. The fact that his sentence was reduced to 2 years says that everyone believed that he did not commit that crime and he was only pleading guilty and being sentenced to stop him from being lynched. After Jerome was lynched, Luther remained in jail. Tempe was released on bond, but the stress of everything caused her to have a breakdown. She was committed to the psychiatric ward at Charity Hospital in New Orleans. As for John Wilson, he too was forced to do something that his family had not done in decades. He had to sell one of his farms. John wrote to NAACP Secretary Walter White begging him for help. He said that he was on the verge of ruin, but the NAACP could not help the Wilsons and save their farm. This was the Great Depression, and everyone was strapped for cash. The NAACP used the lynching of Jerome as another chance to highlight the importance of passing anti-lynching legislation. Racial mob violence had long been a problem in the Jim Crow South, and the NAACP and others had been trying to get Congress to pass a federal anti-lynching law, but Congress had refused to pass the bill. Over 100 anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress between 1882 and 1952. Not a single one passed. Southern legislators led the opposition to the bill. Their most common reason was that the federal government should not tell the southern states how to deal with black people. The NAACP lobbied Louisiana Senator and former Governor Huey Long to support the Costigan-Wagner anti-lynching bill. Long did not support the bill and dismissed Jerome's lynching. He said that Jerome got what he deserved, and the fact that his conviction was overturned was the product of a smart lawyer getting the black person off on a technicality. I should mention that when he referred to Jerome, he used a racial slur. This incident broke the Wilson family. Injustice undid 100 years of progress. After the lynching, the Wilson family was scattered. John was trying to find a way to hold on to his family's land, and Tempe was in the hospital suffering from a mental break. Their younger children, Burnell, Onshell, and Felton, were left in the care of their oldest daughter, Alexine. One day, a white man named John King, who was a neighbor to the Wilsons and had bought their other farm, came to Alexine and told her that he heard a rumor that there were plans to lynch the rest of the Wilson family, and he thought it was best if they all left the parish immediately. A few days later, the family moved to the black town of Scotlandville, which is outside of Baton Rouge, where Tempe's older sister Ophelia Scarborough lived with her 2 daughters. John Wilson and his 5 children crammed themselves into a 3-bedroom shotgun house in Scotlandville. The fear of the rest of the family being lynched made John sell his remaining property for much less than he paid for it. John lost everything and he eventually ran out of money. All of the wealth that his family had been accumulating since emancipation was wiped out. And to make things worse, this was the Great Depression. Times were hard for everyone, especially black people. This hard-working black man, who had managed to keep and expand his family's land, had to take a job sweeping floors at a grocery store just to feed his family. The criminal case against Luther was dropped in June of 1935, after he had spent a year in jail. All of this injustice had wrecked the Wilson family. Jim Crow had completely broken them beyond repair. And soon the Wilson family split up. Tempe left with her and John's youngest child, Anshel, and went to Chicago to live with Tempe's sister, Kezzy, and Inez, and her mother, Julia. Alexine, Burnell, and Felton stayed behind in Scotlandville with their aunt. They were able to help support themselves by taking in clothes to make alterations to. They used the skill of sewing that their mother had taught them, and they were also helped by their uncle, Samuel Wilson. He would drive up from Washington Parish every 2 weeks with food and items that had been donated by friends and family. Eventually, Uncle Samuel was able to raise enough money to send Felton and Burnell to Chicago to join their mother. Alexine remained in Scotlandville until she too left for Chicago in the spring of 1936. The Wilson children never saw their father again. John Wilson's family had been destroyed, and I can only imagine the pain he felt knowing that injustice and racism had taken everything from him. He died in April of 1945 at the age of 64. Bruce and Luther worked and lived in Chicago. Luther worked in the stockyards and Bruce worked at a steel mill. All of the Wilson children, with the exception of Luther, married and had children. Luther Wilson died at the age of 40 in Chicago in 1941. Felton Wilson was drafted into the Navy and served in World War II. This is his actual draft registration card. In 1946, he married a woman named Vivian Lawson. Felton died in February of 1997 at the age of 74. And Bruce died in 1987, also at the age of 74. Anshel married a man named Carroll Thompson in 1945. He was a very prominent pastor of the West Point Missionary Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago. Anshel died in 2005 at the age of 85. Alexine married a man named Robert Young in 1941 in Chicago. She and Robert eventually moved to New York and she worked in Manhattan's Garment District. She died in 2002 at the age of 85. Burnell married a man named Robert Woods in 1937. She died in 1996 at the age of 78. Tempe died in October of 1975 at the age of 93 in Chicago in the nursing home. Despite her long life, the events of 1934 and 1935 haunted Tempe. She needed to be cared for and looked after for the rest of her life. We have the story and family history of the Wilsons because of the work of Horace Mann Bond. He was a black intellectual and social scientist and historian and university president, and he was also the father of famed civil rights activist Julian Bond. But in 1934, Horace Mann Bond was 29 years old and had not yet risen to prominence. At the time, he was a professor at Fisk University. Bond and his wife Julia were in Louisiana as part of their work for the Rosenwald Fund. This was a philanthropic organization started by Julius Rosenwald, the owner of the Sears and Roebuck Company. Rosenwald had built hundreds of schools all across the South for black students. Many of black people's first schools were Rosenwald schools. Bond was a member of the Rosenwald Fund's School Exploration Group. Members of the group were assigned to go to rural areas in the South where Rosenwald schools were to study them and to determine if they were helping black people. Horace Mann Bond was assigned to the area of Star Creek, Louisiana. That's a few miles north of Franklinton, which was in Washington Parish. Bond knew the Wilson family and wrote about what happened to them. He had intended to publish a book on the events and give the proceeds to the Wilsons so they could start over. However, after the horrific events, the Wilsons left Washington Parish and moved to Chicago, and he was never able to complete the book. It's because of this unfinished book that he titled 40 Acres and a Mule that we have the Wilson story. His manuscript sat untouched for 60 years until researchers started reviewing it in the 1990s. At the beginning of this video, I told you that this story captured me. I tell these stories because I believe that it's important to understand what black people have gone through in this country. The injustice that black people have faced is real, and we are not making it up or exaggerating. But this story was different for me. I'm from Chicago, but I went to law school in Louisiana. The Wilson family relocated to Scotlandville after the lynching. I drove through Scotlandville every day on my way to and from law school. I knew that it was a black town, but I had no idea that each day that I drove down Scotland Avenue, that I was driving through the pain and suffering of the Wilson family. In law school, I was a part of a program that taught the law to high school students, and the school that I taught at was Scotlandville High School. As I read about the Wilson family, I wondered if I taught some of their family members. And there's another part of this story that I reflected on. The Wilson family fled Louisiana and moved to the south side of Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago. The 1950 census records show Felton, his wife Vivian, and their child living with Tempe on 49th and Indiana Avenue. I know the exact location where they lived. I have been by that building many times, and I had no idea that each time I passed by down that street that a family lived there that had endured a tremendous amount of pain and injustice. I went to school with Wilsons who were from that area. I know where the church is that Anshell's husband pastored at. It's quite possible that I have crossed paths with the Wilson family in Chicago, and that I likely still do. This is what injustice has done to black families. It has robbed us of wealth and our peace and dignity and justice and our lives. The Wilson family suffered every injustice that could be done to a black person. They managed to make it out of slavery and gained a footing in this world, only to have Jim Crow rip it all away from them. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of the Wilson family, and how did it make you feel learning all that they went through? Leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts.